almost all continents are covered from what I can see. So it is our challenge to feed the thoughts of all of you. And we will have time to questions and answers, so you can have opportunities to comment and ask questions. So let me say also that this webinar will be recorded. It will be available on YouTube. And also it's more comfortable for every one of you to stay muted until you have the floor. So in this second session, Reiner Braun, who is IPB Executive Director, and Colin, a former IPB General Secretary since 1990, will take you to a journey into the peace movement all through during the Cold War period to now, with documents including video contributions from activists, of course involved in the famous protest in the 80s, in the 90s, and from different countries. So many things have changed. But the rejection of war and militarism has always been part of our society all over the world. And if we will mainly focus on Europe and North American movements, the solidarity and the globality of our movement has built and strengthened through the years, and IPB is more and more a global movement. So as I said, both webinars will present contribution will present opportunities for questions and comments. So I give the floor to Eskil in Berlin. He will explain the technical details on how to discuss and how to contribute. So Eskil, the floor is yours. Oh, it's Sean. Sorry.
That's all right. Hey, everyone. We'll just quickly go through a couple images here where you can see how you can raise your hand. So we ask if you have questions and comments, you can, of course, use the chat feature, which is available to everyone. We also have the raise hand feature. So when we get to the discussion session, we'll go through in order of who raised their hands, in that order, to answer any questions that anyone has. So as you can see on the screen here, at the bottom of the Zoom, there is a button called participants, or a similar word in another language. You can click on that button, and when you do, there will be a sidebar that comes up, or a separate screen that will have a couple options. Some of you might see the raise hand option directly on that, but if you don't, there are 3 dots, and if you click on those dots, then you will have the option to raise your hand. We can then see that your hand is raised, and we'll make note of that, so then when we get to discussion, we can answer your questions. If you see it, just in case, there's this other view as well, where you can see, again, raise hand or everything else. So hopefully you are all able to find that. In case you are not, you can ask your question in the chat function, and we will try to answer those as well.
Okay, wonderful. So now let's go to the first speaker. This is Reiner Braun. He's actual IPB Executive Director. So Reiner has always been a well-known figure in the German and international peace movement since the early 80s. He has led peace organizations of scientists like Ines and Pugwash, and lawyers such as Yalana. He has been a dedicated member of the leadership of IPB for a long time, before being, for the last 6 years, IPB co-president. So Reiner has written many books, articles, and contributions that you can find online. But let me add that he's what is to me the most, or his most important and precious contribution. Reiner is a genuine organizer and a strategist for the peace movement internationally. So we are really privileged to hear his thoughts live about the movement, past and present. So thank you, Reiner.
Yeah, thank you, Arielle, for this very nice introduction. And I will speak about the period from 1949 till to 1919. It is a rush through this period, so please excuse when I definitely forget something or reduce some important event to a short sentence. The first point I would do is I would like to characterize the time I'm speaking about. The key point of this time is that we were living at that time in a period of a bloc confrontation between two blocs, political, military, economic, and ideological blocs, with a superpower in each bloc. We had on one side the so-called liberal capitalistic systems and states, which could sometimes even include fascist states like Spain or Portugal. And on the other side, so-called socialist system with the Soviet Union as the biggest power in the East Bloc. The dominance of these superpowers were ruling the world, and they were always cleaning their blocs. The US was pushing in Iran with Great Britain together in Guatemala and Chile after 550 rebellions. The Soviet Union was making interventions in East Germany in 53, in Hungary 56, and in Czech Republic in 69, and in Afghanistan later. So they were cleaning their two blocs, and they closed their two blocs in confrontation to each other. Both blocs founded their military alliances. On one side, NATO. Interesting point, NATO was founded in 49, and even 6 years later, in 55, the Warsaw Pact, the East Bloc was founded. And frankly speaking, you know, when you look to the history, the NATO was never only a defense bloc, it has always aggressive implications. This period has some highlights in negative sense. One of the most negative highlights was a brutal and bloody Korean War in the middle of the 50s, with a fight even including China, which victory of the communist system in 49 again changed dramatically the power structure of the world. There were two more highlights where the two blocs were really in deep confrontation, and the nuclear war was a danger of a second. This was above all the Cuban crisis, where it was on one side the negotiation between Kennedy and Khrushchev, but on the other side the lack that the Russian submarine commander does not fulfill his orders, that there was no nuclear war which could destroy the whole world. And the second situation was the building of the Berlin Wall, where in the middle of the city of Berlin, the tanks from both sides stay in a difference from 50 centimeters next to each other in confrontation. The second characteristic of this period is the development of the nuclear weapons. First nuclear weapons in 45. Till 49, we had only one nuclear weapons country. Then the Soviet Union broke the monopoly of the United States and was the second country with nuclear weapons. At the highest amount of numbers of nuclear weapons, we had in the 80s 70,000 nuclear weapons all over the world. The huge majority nuclear weapons in the United States and the Soviet Union. Nuclear arms race was one of the brutal elements and the politics of this deterrence element of this period. And we had the enlargement from the nuclear countries 2 to 5. Great Britain, China, and France were joining the nuclear weapons community, and later on also India, Pakistan, and Israel, and after 90s, also North Korea. The third main point of this period was the decolonization of the world, the development of the independent countries, mainly in Asia and Africa, and the founding of a so-called non-alignment movement of these more or less political independent countries, but they were never economic independent. They played a very important role in the discussion of the polity of détente and of new relations between the two blocs. These anti-colonialistic fights were very often not peaceful. Remember I will only remember shortly the most peaceful activities. This was a fight in India by Mahatma Gandhi. But we had the brutal wars in Algeria, Congo, Indonesia, and other countries, and I will come back to Vietnam a little bit later. The fifth point of this period was the founding of and growing of international organizations. There were developed a lot of international organizations under the UN as affiliates of the United Nations, as a subgroup of the United Nations, but there were also a lot of regional international organizations. The internationalizing of politics was a character of this period. And the sixth point, above all in the beginning, but also in the 68, was the attraction of socialist ideas for many people all around the world. This movement at the time and in all the period was fighting against war, above all against the most brutal kind of war, against the danger of nuclear disarmament. Nuclear disarmament was a key point of the activities of the peace movement at that time. I will mention three main events of this time. First of all was the Stockholm Appeal from 1950, developed by the World Peace Council by famous scientists of this period, which were calling for a nuclear weapon-free world and got people saying between 600 million and 800 million signatures. The second one, maybe the most important scientific appeal in history, was the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955, calling for a world free of nuclear weapons. Until today, the organization which were developed, which comes out of this appeal, the Pugwash movement, is an important part of the anti-nuclear weapons movement. And their leader, one of their leaders, Joseph Rotblat, got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995. In the second half of the 50s, at the end of the 50s, were developed the Easter marches coming from Great Britain, spreading all over Europe. And we had a lot of activities related to nuclear testing and to different activities in the different countries. The second point of this period was that the peace movement was, I think we can say, deeply divided. We had on one side IPB and friendly organizations around IPB or connected with IPB, like, for example, War Resisters International, which were partly a member of IPB, or even Pax Christi. And on the other side, we had the World Peace Council, which was mainly dependent from the Soviet Union foreign politics and paying. And both were developing activities against arms race and for nuclear disarmament. And both were also a little bit, they were fighting against each other. These politics of confrontation changed during the 60s. I think the political leaders on both sides, on the Western side mainly connected partly to Kennedy, but also to Willy Brandt and Olaf Palme, and on the East side saw that these politics of confrontation could lead to the destroyment of the whole world. And they are coming more and more to politics of detente, developing the politics of common security and relations between each other. The highlight of these relations was the European Security Conference 75 in Helsinki, prepared by negotiations between West Germany and above all the Soviet Union, but also the other socialist country. West Germany for the first time accepted the borders which were a result of the Second World War. These politics of common security, which means I have to take into account that the other side had at the same mind interests that I have interests, and we have to try to bring the interests together and find where we can find common solution, having in mind the interest of both sides. This is the opposite of confrontation, which always means that I have to fight against the other side. This politics was more or less coming to a success, but it was the result of the actions of the peace movement in the 60s. And one of the leading figures of this peace movement at that time, who was part of many, many activities, was Bruce Kent from Great Britain, who who was a chair of the International Peace Bureau, and he says some words to the time.
Sorry, give me 1 second. Need to share the sound too. Sorry, everyone, just 1 second.
Thank
There we go.
The early 60s, there were the marches into London by C&D, and that certainly transformed thinking at the time. We had Trafalgar Square in the centre of London packed several times. I think in a very odd way, the Vietnam War had a negative effect on us because so many activists went off to campaign on the Vietnam War, as if nuclear weapons was some separate issue. And we continued with our nuclear weapon campaign. So I think that the first idea of not having nuclear weapons, of Canon Collins and Bertrand Russell, I think was very effective at the time, up till about 1965 or 66. And then the Vietnam War took over for activism and began to go downhill. So we've had high points and we've had low points. There's no straight line between war and peace. It's up and down and up and down and up and down all the time.
Bruce Kent mentioned one of the most important activities of the peace movement in the 70s, even the end of the 60s. This was a fight against the Vietnam War and for peace in Vietnam. It started as a fight against the French engagement in the Vietnam Wars in the 50s, and it continues as a huge wave of actions in the 60s and 70s, mainly organized by young people in the different countries all around the world, mainly in Western Europe and in the United States. The actions against the peace movement, the action of the peace movement against the Vietnam War really changed political behavior in Central Europe and in the United States. And a historical interesting point is that the politics of detente was becoming a success when in the same time the Vietnam War happened. So this shows that you can develop in politics of detente even in very difficult international situation. And this could be also an advice for today. The historical situation in the middle of the 70s, of the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, end of the 70s was that for the first time we had communication and relations between the two blocs. And one of the main points of this part was that people could start speaking to each other, that the war becomes a little bit more open, but this time again changed. Again changed in the end of the 70s to a period of confrontation. There are many different reasons why this happened. People are saying it happened because the world was too much changing to the socialist side. Others saying this was the politics of the socialist bloc was coming back to the politics of confrontation. Clear is that a highlight of the politics of confrontation starts and become a highlight with Ronald Reagan when he becomes president in the beginning of the year 81. Ronald Reagan in the beginning has two aims. Like Trump, America first, and the second, kill the Soviet Union by developing an intensive arms race and reduce their power in the world. Ronald Reagan developed new nuclear weapons. He wanted to have weapons in space, and he starts a huge politics of confrontation against the Soviet Union and wanted to have new nuclear weapons, Pershing II and cruise missiles in Europe. This was the beginning of a peace wave the history never had seen. The peace movement of the 80s, up to now, the biggest peace movement over years, starting in 79, 80 in the different European countries, because the European countries would be the victim of the war. And in the US strategies, you could read that a regional nuclear war in Europe is possible. And Travel Office of the United States make an announcement, go to Europe so long it is possible. And this reflects only to the strategies you could read in the Pentagon papers. This peace movement in the years from 80 to 83 brought millions of people in the different countries on the streets. They were acting, they were mobilizing all over the world. It brings new forces and new coalitions together. It overcomes old splits and really had a mass input on the political development of these years. This peace movement was young, it was active, it founded a lot of new organizations. And when we are speaking about IPB at that time, we have to say that IPB was not one of the main organizers of that actions and activities. It's even a little bit by side, but it was a part of the negotiation process for reducing nuclear weapons. It was a part of the discussion about the test ban and of other activities for reducing nuclear weapons and military spending. This period ended politically with the loss of the peace movement, because Pershing II and cruise missiles were coming to Europe. But it changed the opinions of millions of people. It brought new majorities in the countries of the people against nuclear weapons. And it created a lot of new atmospheres in the country. One of the colleagues of us who were a part of this movement when she was very young at that time was Kate Hudson, the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And Kate is giving us now some impressions about the activities in Great Britain at that time.
In the early 1980s, the peace movement in Britain, that's the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was starting to really rev up around opposing Trident. That was the new US system which was coming to Britain, but also the government's intention here in Britain to allow cruise missiles, US cruise missiles, to come to Britain. And these were missiles that meant the US and the Soviet Union could have a nuclear war in Europe, and they would be so-called safe on the coach in the dark out to Greenham Common Air Base, and 30,000 odd women were also there, and we held hands around the base, and it was dark and it was cold, but it was the most fantastic atmosphere. So we'd seen what the women who were living at the base, you know, the encampments around the base, some of the kind of incredible pressures that they were under, not only politically, you know, huge onslaught in the press against them, people in Parliament, ministers and so on, Mrs. Thatcher's ministers, you know, at the same time, they expressed the sentiments and the emotions of countless millions of women and people across the country. See, they were called benders, the kind of constructions in which many of them lived, and there were teepees and other forms of bivouac and so on, but the campfires, just their incredible commitment and determination and their creativity, you know, the way the fence was decorated, you know, when they broke into the airbase, you know, dancing on the silos, you know, it was just extraordinary, really, really extraordinary.
This peace movement in the 80s, when you speak about it, you have to speak about one of the biggest movements in one of the superpower countries, the United States of America. We had at that time huge demonstrations in Washington, and we had a campaign for freezing all nuclear weapons. And one of the leaders of this campaign in the United States was Paul Walker, and he also gave us some impressions of the time of the 80s.
mid to late 70s, early to mid 80s were just a plethora, of activities across the board about reducing risk of nuclear war, writing, publishing, doing public education, working through universities to educate younger people who were very concerned. And then the nuclear free statement, which we had all been, many of us were working on, Randy Forsberg was heading up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, really became quite prominent. And the freeze movement was founded by Randy and finally resulted in a giant 1982 protest march, anti-nuclear protest march in New York City. And we put together over 1 million marchers in New York City, demanding basically a freeze, a stop to both Soviet and U.S. stop to testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons, to give everyone, the Soviets and Americans and others, time to talk about it. I think the nuclear freeze march really showed Reagan and the former president, Jimmy Carter, so it was very bipartisan, that nuclear weapons were not well liked, and in fact, we wanted to abolish nuclear weapons in a large majority, I think, of the American public.
In this time, we had one peace movement which called themselves the peace movement of the two blocks. This was the European Nuclear Disarmament Campaign organized by peace activists from both sides of the Iron Curtain. And this movement shows the way to the future of new contacts on both sides and develop maybe the new period, which no one who was active in the beginning and the middle of the 80s could believe that it would happen so quick. Because in this situation of a new period of confrontation, a light raised, a light for change, for a new period which was overcoming the confrontation. And this was a period which starts maybe in the middle of the 80s. And this period has two names. One name I try to describe, this was a peace movement which tried to change the society, the public opinion, gave signs and ways for a new politics of disarmament and atonement. And the second name was Mikhail Gorbachev, who became secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in '85. And he comes out with suggestions which surprised the whole world. Suggestions for a nuclear weapon-free world, suggestions for reducing the Russian and Soviet Union weapons, for shortening and cutting the military budget in the Soviet Union, and for a new politics which he called the politics of new thinking. The word perestroika and glasnost changed the world in the 80s. And the combination of the actions of the peace movement and these politics of Mikhail Gorbachev, which found its background in the politics of political leaders in the Western countries, like Willy Brandt, like Egon Bahr, and also like Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and also in the United States, was the starting point for a new period, which I would call the golden time of arms control and disarmament. This was a period of starting in '85. This period developed new contracts for disarmament and arms control. I will only mention one, and then I will come to one a little bit more in detail. One was the comprehensive test stop. People were working on this since 1945, and in the middle of the second half of the 80s, it becomes reality. And someone who was fighting all the time on the French side for this test stop treaty was Arielle Denis, and Arielle gave also some comments to these activities.
We focused on nuclear tests. Sounds naive now, but our belief was that if they can't test, they can't build new weapons. So nuclear weapons will stop because they won't be able to test them. And so we spent a lot of energy working for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that started in this period in the 80s. Then we had the treaty in 96. Nuclear weapons have always been enveloped with secrecy. And we started to know about the impact on the people, on the health, on the environment. We started to learn how dangerous it was. And we thought that's a very good way to denounce nuclear tests, to speak about their impact. We started to, let's say, open this track, which now is called humanitarian disarmament, but not attack the strategic aspect of the weapon, but attack its impact on people and the environment, like it was done afterwards against the, let's say, landmines, for example. So this strategy really opened us the way to the treaty. And that's also something I learned in these years, which we used again to obtain the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, in 2017.
Maybe the most important treaty of that time, next to many others, was the Treaty of banning nuclear weapons from Europe. The US and the Soviet Union weapons from nuclear weapons, so-called INF Treaty, signed by Gorbachev and Reagan in 87, ratified in 88. And this treaty destroyed a whole category of very modern nuclear weapons on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And it was a treaty which was the biggest success of the peace movement, who always were fighting for this agreement. And IPB and others were always supporting the negotiations and the development to such a treaty. This period comes to a new period of cooperation in Central Europe. It opened the Iron Curtain and created a new Europe. It leads to the end of the Warsaw Pact, and it leads to an agreement which many of us have forgotten now, the Charter of Paris, signed in November 1990. This Charter of Paris is something like a cooperation, disarmament charter for Europe. And this shows, signed by all European countries, the Soviet Union, and later all Russia and all the following up countries of the Soviet Union. And this treaty should open, and maybe this was our illusions, the way to the peace dividend and the way to a new, secure and peaceful Europe. This was our hope, and this was a great chance at the end of 1990. And this is the end of my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reiner. Can you see me? Thank you. So now it's time for questions and answers. It was such a long period with so many things happening, with all a lot of the participants have been actors in this period. So I guess everyone wants to share its comments, and so let's go. I see who is raising his hand.
Don't see any hands raised at the moment.
So it was not my goal to kill all arguments. But maybe we have a better discussion at the end, then Colin should continue.
Okay, we can do that. If everyone agrees, we can go and have listen to Colin's presentation, and then you will have time for questions and discussions. There are some questions I want to ask, but it can wait till the end. So, Colin, are you ready? Colin, he has studied. First, he was.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Colin has first studied development issues, and he works in development organization. It's just in the 80s that he joined IPB as general secretary, and he served IPB for 26 years. So he knows a lot about the peace movement in the world. He has built a membership to up to 300 organizations and developed many aspects of the peace work, disarmament, peace history, conflict transformation, peace education, gender, development, and culture of peace. And well, he has been traveling all over the world. He has been involved in a very extensive range of international peace and disarmament programs and conferences, including the World Court Project on nuclear weapons, the Hague Appeal for Peace, the Global Campaign for Peace Education. And since 2005, he started one of the still most important campaign of the International Peace Bureau. It's Disarmament for Sustainable Development, which now is called the Global Campaign on Military Spending. So there is a lot to say about Colin, but he will share his journey with us. So let's see what from all this has been most important for him. Thank you.
Well, good day, everybody. Can you hear me? I hope so. Yes. I have a feeling we might not keep to our deadline of 90 minutes, but that's up to Arielle how she wants to handle it. If I go on too long, you have to wave a flag or something. Okay. So I want to just say one or two things just to begin. Firstly, it's very hard to be objective about a recent period, and especially when you've been involved in it yourself. All the previous speakers have mainly been talking about a period that's really before them, although I know Reiner was active in the period and so on. But I think the other point about this period from 1990 to now is that it's a much more complicated global picture with all kinds of issues interlocking and a very different kind of relationships between big powers and also small powers, and small powers who become bigger powers. So it's densely packed with thousands and thousands of peace projects all over the world. So this is going to be a rather different presentation, although I will try to give it the political context. But it's going to focus, as Arielle already suggested, really, on several of the main IPB program areas, projects, if you like. This is more of a project approach than political analysis. So in the discussion, perhaps we can go a lot broader because I cannot possibly cover even some of the medium-sized activities that IPB has been involved in. The third thing to say is that I'm not going to mention very many individuals, partly because, I mean, leadership is important. And of course, very many people have done extraordinary things to drive the movement forward. But I believe essentially that the peace movement is a collective endeavor. And so I'm going to focus more on organizations than individuals. But since I have you all on the line, I do want to recognize and salute everyone who has been with us along this amazing journey, in my case from 1990 onwards. And of course, many of you are present in this meeting today. So well done. We did a lot, really an enormous amount, but it was never enough. Okay, that's my first little piece. I'm going to present this as a 3-course meal, and there is an appetizer to start with. If I can get I hope I can get the documents in the right order. This first part is to look at what types of peace movements do we have. So let me just see if I can do it. Just be patient with me. There we are. Types of peace movement. I hope you can see that and the pictures don't get in the way. I go very quickly because there's no time for really in-depth discussion. And this is not the last word on how you divide up peace movements, obviously. But first of all, geographically, you know, from the very smallest local peace group up to the biggest international. And also one could consider how many members, what sort of size, you know, we have all sizes and types. Ideologically, I mean, I've divided it here into the liberal pacifist, the people that want to do it through law, people that are opposed to militarism as such, and the nuclear pacifist coalition building, which was a different type during the Cold War and beyond. And then the sectors, which we'll come to. And of course, ideology is also related to parties. We have in the peace movement people mainly on the left, but different kinds of left, as you see. And then the sectors, we've developed a specialism in these last 30 years of linking peace to all kinds of other issues in society. And some it's very explicitly, for example, we developed disarmament for development. There are peace groups, Labour CND is specifically on the relationship between the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and Labour. Many different women's organizations, human rights, race, and so on. And all the professions, the scientists, the lawyers, the educationists, and so on. Now, some people have divided peace movements in the analytical literature into those that are opposed to all wars, some specific wars like Vietnam or Iraq, some specific aspects like nuclear weapons, and others who want to focus on the positive side. How do we create a culture of peace? How do we develop conflict resolution? And then issues relating to the sectors mentioned above. Finally, an interesting area to discuss is the style of work. Are we reacting to what governments do and what private sector actors do? Or are we proactive, setting our own agendas? Are we on the inside track, close to government or close to the United Nations or the EU? Or are we doing outside, what I call outside track, protesting at military bases and working locally? Are we prophetic? Many of the religious groups might recognize that word, but I think secular groups too, who have a very broad agenda, who say we want to abolish war. You know, that's a prophetic demand. It's not a pragmatic one. And then secondly, related to that, are we talking about long-term change or short-term victory? Now, the point of going through this is to state that in the IPB membership, we have all types of peace organization. And this was certainly what I was not exactly shocked, but overwhelmed to discover on getting into my seat in Geneva in August 1990, just 1 week after Saddam had invaded Kuwait, to discover that we had this huge family of all types of people and all kinds of arguments going on between them. It was quite a challenge, and it has become even more of a challenge as the membership has advanced. Now we probably doubled it from 150 to over 300. So that's the end of that little appetizer. Now I want to come to the main dish. So I have to share with you another screen here, which is called the timeline. Now, this will be difficult to read, and I don't expect you to be able to take it all in. On the left, we have a variety of what seem to be important events in the world. Of course, I have missed many things. I realize I've missed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, for example. But it gives you an idea of the diversity of things. Here you've got the arrival of Google and iMac, the International Space Station. We have all sorts of things, terrorism, YouTube. It's been an incredibly diverse period of political and also scientific and technological change. Now, what I've got on the right-hand side are some of the key IPB programs, and I will go through them in a minute with some photographs. But I want to just scroll down a little bit here so you can take this in. A few highlights. Look at this, 1995, the first IPB website. That was an indicator that things were beginning to change. And I want to make a point here that the historic role of IPB, especially you'll have noticed this if you followed the previous webinar, was to try to bring together, I mean, very ambitiously, all movements around the world into one big house. Well, it might have been possible in the 1890s, but it certainly wasn't possible in the 1990s. And this was accelerated by the internet. So that instead of having this, in some cases, rather pyramidal structure of a federation with a central committee and somewhat top down, we moved very rapidly into a much more horizontal form of organizing, networking around the world. This is the new structure of organizing that we live in today. And it began really quite early in my time at the IPB. And I realized that we would need to have a different response, a different way of operating with member organizations and other partners. The second thing I want to say is that although that was a challenge, we developed another role, which was to be a kind of launch pad for international projects. And all of the programs that are highlighted in green here were in some sense launched from the launch pad of the IPB with other organizations. And I think that has proved to be a very useful role. Thirdly, if you remember that great list of sectors and professions, we have developed a way of working with very many kinds of specialists. IPB essentially is the generalists organization for peace, but the way we've worked has been through cooperating, for example, on the World Court project, which we'll come to, very much with the lawyers, with the Campaign for Peace Education, obviously with the educators. And when we came to military spending, it was with economists and political economists. So that has been something rather special about our particular style as an organization. That's the end of that piece. You see, I bring it right up to Black Lives Matter and on the last line, but it, ... suggests there might be some other big events still to come. Now I want to come to the programs themselves. And I have some pictures here. IPB programs from 1990. This, of course, is taken from the IPB website, which I hope you are regular visitors to. So the first one, the World Court Project. And I really love this very happy picture of, particularly with Japanese and British and other activists, together with the boxes of petitions, millions of petitions to the International Court, to focus their attention on what actually happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, if you had taken the view at the end of the 1990s that the Cold War was over, peace was breaking out, there was a peace dividend about to be unleashed, and nuclear weapons were no longer a problem. Some people did take this point of view, but I think many in the IPB and in other anti-nuclear organizations were well aware that although there might be reductions, and there were major reductions in nuclear weapon stocks, none of the nuclear weapon states were in any way committed to getting rid of them altogether. They still clung to this ideology of deterrence. And some already in the 80s were thinking, well, there has to be another way of doing this, because demonstrations, even with 1 million people in Central Park, it hasn't solved the problem. Lobbying governments hasn't solved the problem. Educating the public hasn't solved it. So let's try another way. And the lawyers got together, eventually under the banner of IALANA, the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, which and still is a IPB member organization. And they came up with a very ingenious plan to take the question of the legal status of nuclear weapons to the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice that you see in the picture. And to do that, they used Article 96 of the UN Charter. If you look it up, it makes it clear that any UN organ, such as the General Assembly, can put a question to the court, and the Security Council cannot veto it. The nuclear powers could not stop it. So, well, it was a long process and a long campaign, and we developed an international steering committee to organize education work and lobbying to try to get governments to support this resolution, first in the World Health Assembly. Eventually, it was successful from the General Assembly of the United Nations. IPB's role was to organize the launch event, which took place in 1992, which was our centenary year in Geneva, where we put to the UN the McBride appeal from lawyers, 11,000 top lawyers condemning nuclear weapons. That packed a certain kind of punch. We also published a book, and here it is, From Hiroshima to The Hague, by Keith Motherson, who you saw in the last picture. And this provided a kind of campaign manual, and especially focused on the idea of articulating the dictates of the public conscience, as the law has it. Through declarations of the public conscience, we got millions of these pieces of paper signed by individuals saying that nuclear weapons is an offense to our sense of morality and sense of the law. So to speed on, we did achieve a historic ruling from the advisory ruling from the International Court of Justice in 1996, which condemned the use of nuclear weapons. However, it's true it was not a perfect ruling. There was one particular paragraph that talked about the survival of when the survival of a state is at stake. On that point, the court was split and they could not make a firm opinion, and it was seen as a weakness by some people. However, I think this campaign had several benefits, one of which was to really put the question of the legal status in doubt, because clearly nuclear weapons violate every humanitarian law there is. And secondly, it helped to build a new coalition, which gave rise in 1995 to a cooperation known as Abolition 2000, a network of anti-nuclear groups from all over the world that gathered initially at the side meetings of the Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences, and later as a freestanding network, and still going to this day. And one of the key projects of that coalition was to draft a draft nuclear weapons convention, a full-blown treaty to abolish nuclear weapons, which of course has not yet been signed. However, I think that draft convention also laid the ground for what is now the ban treaty and the work of ICAN and so on. So I think progress in this field has gone through a number of stepping stones, a number of steps, and I'm very proud that IPB took a lead in the World Court project. Now, we come to number 2, the Hague Appeal for Peace and the Global Campaign for Peace Education. Having developed this cooperation essentially between lawyers and doctors and the general peace movement, we decided that it would be appropriate for the end of the century, the end of the millennium, and for the end of the decade of international law to try to hold a really major commemoration to remember what had happened in The Hague 100 years before that, in 1899, when the Tsar invited the governments not to divide up the spoils from war, but to create a new peace system. And of course, out of that, from the 1899 and 1907 conferences, we have the 2 Hague Conventions, which were milestones in international humanitarian law. So, to cut a long story short, yet again, we devised a coalition which organized possibly one of the largest peace meetings in history with 10,000 people. Now, 10,000 isn't very big when you have a demonstration, but for an international peace movement conference, it's absolutely enormous. And it was a really extraordinary event. And it covered every single subject in the peace universe, everything from human rights to landmines, to small arms, to nuclear weapons, to Kosovo, and so on and so on. We had Kofi Annan, we had the Nobel laureates, we had 100 organizations helping us develop the outreach. And this was the poster, the famous, done by a famous American artist, No Go, no to nuclear weapons, go to the dove of peace. So here we are, and I think it's a bad picture, the final ceremony. Look how many speakers there are. There must be about 20 speakers at least in that final panel. We had 2 slogans, the human right to peace and time to abolish war, a pretty ambitious agenda. And it was all put together in a brilliant way, really, to create a document that could really last for many, many years, the Hague Agenda for Peace and Justice for the 21st century, because we were looking ahead to the years that we are now living in. And that document, which has 50 chapters, 50 paragraphs, if you like, really is a very good manifesto for peacemaking. I commend it to everyone, and I can put it into the the documentation that you'll receive after the meeting. You can get all of this by email later on. Now, after the conference, the organizing group with the 4 main organizations sat down and said, well, how are we going to follow this up? Because, 50 topics was really far too much. You had to find something that was manageable and something that wasn't being done by many organizations already. So we focused on peace education, because peace education, as you can see from the little picture here, I mean, it covers all sorts of things, not just disarmament, but also conflict resolution, gender, environment, human rights, and many other topics. And we felt that there was a need not just for peace education activities. There were plenty of education programs around the world, but what we didn't have was a campaign to really force governments to say, look, you really have to include peace education on the school curriculum at every level, from preschool right the way up to university and beyond. Now, okay, we're still working on it. There still is a global campaign for peace education, and I recommend it to you. They have the very best newsletter that I know on peace education. Tony Jenkins is the coordinator of that. So I recommend, if you're in any way involved in peace education, make sure that you get the regular updates from that campaign. One of IPB's contributions, because we had 2 offices, one in New York and one in Geneva, and we decided to take on the area of working with young people, because we didn't want this just to be something organized by teachers, by parents, by the elderly ones. We wanted to hear the youth voices. And so we produced this youth agenda, which was also very popular and well received. And we created the first of many waves of a youth network for peace. Now, in 2004, I'm jumping ahead a bit now. 2004, we decided it was time to commemorate Bertha von Suttner, because, in 1905, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. She was the one who persuaded Alfred Nobel to set up the award, and she was the first woman to receive it. And she was, of course, IPB vice president, one of the key founders of the organization. And so we devised a program that was both peace education, peace history, and also conflict resolution and conflict transformation in the present tense, because right at this time, there was still a lot of activity in Eastern Europe where women were involved in peacemaking as a result of the tragedies in the Balkans and in other parts of Eastern Europe. So we brought together women in particular and others in places like Vienna and Prague, which were, of course, the places where Bertha von Suttner herself was born and was active. And also in Geneva, we had exhibitions, we had publications, and so on. So this was the first of, in fact, not the first, but one of the early commemorations of the IPB Nobel Peace Prizes. You may or may not know that we have 13 Nobel Peace Prizes within our leadership. No other organization has so many Nobel Peace Prizes. And so since they started in 1901, in 2001, we began a whole series of events to commemorate our pioneers. Now, disarmament for development. This represents a radical break. Let's now think about some of the political changes within this period. Of course, we start off with the Cold War and post-Cold War period, when the political agenda becomes very complex. There are United Nations summits on all kinds of big issues. Security Council becomes somewhat unblocked and begins to take some initiatives. But we also have very serious wars in the Balkans and in Rwanda, for example. So the problem of peace is far from being resolved. But there is a somewhat more positive atmosphere. We have figures, sort of social democratic figures like Blair and Clinton. And then, bang, September the 11th, 2001, the whole world begins to change. We have the invasion of Afghanistan. We have a militaristic United States. We have a Bush in the White House. And it's starting to look a much more tough assignment to tackle all this. Military spending starts to go up again, having been reduced at the end of the Cold War. So how did IPB respond to this? I mean, we were in the middle of this campaign on peace education, which is one of the long-term proactive campaigns, if you like. We decided we weren't just going to organize demonstrations. It was more difficult to organize demonstrations in this period. And in any way, demonstrations are essentially the job of local and national bodies. We decided to have a framework that would look, first of all, at a different way of looking at security. And we chose the theme of human security because this was something that the United Nations had developed as a new way of looking at its role and the role of governments. And also peace movements could relate to it in different ways. Those who are working on the arms trade or the conventional weapons, or even issues to do with development and human rights. We published books, we held conferences, we traveled the world, we tried to support the UN when it was saying the right kinds of things. And in 2005, we shaped it in a new form to be a more proactive campaign called Disarmament for Development, or for Sustainable Development, because now sustainable development was now the new fashion. After the conference in Rio in '92, the issue of militarism and environment had already come up. IPB had been present in developing that. So one of the things that you'll see here in the picture is, it's not very clear, but the bread tank was an extraordinary project that Reiner was involved in. I remember in Rio, at the time of one of the big Rio summits, we managed to create a real tank made of metal and then covered it with bread, flat bread, and took it to the favelas where people could enjoy the bread. So it was a way of saying bread, not bombs. And there you see it in the on the slogan on the tank. And it was apparently, I wasn't there, but it was a fantastic mobilizing tool to show what we mean, not just to say what we mean, but to really show it. Okay, here's another of our publications. I haven't time to list all the publications, but this one uses the idea of opportunity costs. What could we be doing with this military money if we were spending it in a different way? And here we tried to relate it to the UN's development agenda, what became known as the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that are still active as a framework for the UN's work, but I have been sadly rather pushed off the radar in recent years. In 2010, that was the centenary of IPB's own Nobel Peace Prize. We launched a whole new project called the Making Peace Photo Exhibition, which is a huge outdoor show, if you like, with 100 big panels of large photographs by well-known photographers and a series of events around it. And this attracted a lot of attention, both people physically coming to look at it and also in the media and on the social media. And in fact, it became a traveling exhibition. We took it to 14 cities all around the world. So including Rio and Tunis and Toronto and Sarajevo and many places. So that was a sort of side program, but I think in many ways quite effective. It probably reached hundreds of thousands of people. Now we come to the third stage, I like to call it, of the work around economics. The first stage was human security. The second stage, disarmament for sustainable development. And the third stage, the Global Days of Action on Military Spending, which of course is a program that is still going actively today. Now, the thinking emerged gradually over a period of years. Some people felt that we needed to have a more specific focus in time. We needed to have a single day to start with, when everybody that we could get in the coalition would work together and do actions in their local area or national programs of many different types. Later on, we realized that one day didn't suit everyone, and so we extended it to days, and I think we're now on to a month, a kind of period of time when we focus on this issue, especially on the day when the Stockholm Institute publishes its annual statistics about the increasing levels of military spending. To bring it right up to date, we have now converted the days into an all-year-round campaign on military spending. So we call this GCOMS, but GDAMS is still existing within the campaign. And this was the webinar we held in April on this. Worth noting that the campaign is now coordinated from the office of our friends in Barcelona. So we have the Berlin office, the Barcelona office, and the Geneva activities. But when I retired, we restructured the IPB. We had a transition period, we closed the office at the Rue de Zurich, and the headquarters has now moved to Berlin. So that's my last word on this section, is that the work must go on. Now, I have a final little bit, if I can, if you will allow me. We've had the main dish. Now you get the, actually, you don't get dessert. You get the recipe for the next one. Okay, what's the recipe? This is Archer's recipe for peace campaigning, if you like. 1, identify an issue. 2, do the research. 3, formulate the demands. 4, devise a strategy. 5, assemble a coalition or coalitions. You may need a separate coalition for the government. 6, nurture the community. Keep everybody happy. Sort out conflicts. It's not easy. 7, offer campaign resources. 8, reach out to the mainstream. Use the media. 9, disseminate the outcome. And very important, evaluate, record what you did and share it with others. Number 10, move to the next level. And with that, let's move to the next level of the webinar. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Colin. It was really interesting and thoughtful. And there is a lot to think about in all of these contributions. So I just open up the contributions and discussions. So who would like to
think Timo should raise her hand first for his.
Okay, so please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Timo Virtala, calling from Finland. And I really enjoyed both of the presentations. And I have a question for both of you. And I will start from Reiner Braun. And you mentioned about how the peace movement was divided during the Cold War. And I would like you to say a little bit more about that. How was the division, and how is the relationship between these peace organizations or peace activists today, now 30 years after the Cold War? I can tell that in Finland, the division was very great during the Cold War. And after the Cold War, all peace organizations have remained and they come very close to each other ideologically, but they are still separate. And that's a good question. Why haven't we joined together now when we agree about things? And perhaps I continue with my other question also to Colin. And this is about the appetizer. Thank you very much for all the delicious menu. In appetizer, you mentioned you divided these peace organizations to many categories, and I would like to have your opinion about one more category. I would say I can divide the Finnish peace organizations very clearly to those who focus on inner peace or changing human individuals, and those who are changing the structures of society. And the first one, the religious and spiritual and educational peace organizations are there. And then there is, I think IPB is more into changing the structures of the society. Just your opinion on this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So please, Reiner, and then Colin.
You know, the division is still today. We have the two organizations. We have the International Peace Bureau and the World Peace Council. But it is very much too strong to say there is a division, because, you know, the World Peace Council in reality is only existing in some countries, and it becomes really a very small organization. The background is very easy. IPB always were looking for money, and we never had enough money, so we could not spend very much money, and the World Peace Council got the money from the socialist countries and had for many, many years a lot of money, so that it could be influential to use this money. And after 89-90, when the socialist bloc collapsed, it was really the end of the World Peace Council in practical activities. But there are national World Peace Council organizations which are partly members of IPB, like Mouvement de la Paix or the Japanese organization and others. And we are working with them together in different campaigns, for example, in the No to War, No to NATO campaign. So the split is not any longer so deep. And we are definitely working together with them against nuclear weapons. And, so it's a new situation. It is not any longer this deep ideological and political split like it was definitely in the 70s and in the 80s. It is more or less try to work together, and hopefully we will also overcome some of the rest of controversies in the near future. We will see. I'm very optimistic in that. Mute.
Colin?
Should I say something?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I agree with Reiner about that. Just to say to Timo that, some organizations do die, but an awful lot do not. They continue in some form, even if it's just one person, or they just have the name, or the website is there. Somebody said to me once, I said, "How is your group going?" He said, "The shop is open, but there are no customers." I thought that was a good way to describe it. In general, there are always more organizations, there are never less, and it's quite rare to have a fusion of existing structures that were previously rather hostile. And in a way, I don't think it really matters, because the new networking style that we have, as I was describing, allows for coalitions and alliances and forums and all sorts of ways in which several or even hundreds of organizations all work together for a limited purpose, for a limited time perhaps. The key thing is, what do we do together, not which hat we're wearing. Now, you're absolutely right about the organizations and also individuals who focus primarily on what could be called inner peace. And I didn't really highlight that. It is there, as you say, under faith, or spiritual education. I could have said psychology among the scientific organizations. So it does interconnect with many of the groups that are working in a more political way. And it is true that IPB's tradition all the way through has been about doing political work. But as I've tried to indicate, it's not just working with politicians, it's working with experts from many fields of human endeavor, from law, from economics, from education, and so on. And I think that many of course, of the greatest peace leaders have been those who have had a spiritual approach and a spiritual following. Think about Gandhi. How many hundreds of millions followed Gandhi? Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu. I mean, I could go on. So clearly that dimension is important, but in all cases, they have challenged power, they've challenged governments, they've challenged oppression. And I think those who only talk about inner peace, I think are perhaps missing something, but it's for each of us to decide where we put our energy.
Okay, Arielle, I believe it's first Paul Walker and then Thomas Daffern.
So, Paul Walker, can you, the floor is yours.
I just unmuted, Arielle. Thank you. I've really enjoyed these presentations, so congratulations to you all, Arielle and Reiner and Colin. In the middle of this pandemic we're all facing and staying at home, it's really fun, basically fun to sort of remember some of the historical events. Let me make a couple of very brief comments and then pose a question. I think to me, when we think back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to the present, one of the key issues has really been who's in charge, who are the leaders. And to me, one of the real leaders of the peace movement was Gorbachev. We were very fortunate to have Gorbachev, become head of the Soviet Union in 1985. And I recall the big international peace conference he organized on about 2 weeks' notice in Moscow. I think it was January '87, if I recall correctly, in which he invited about 1,000 people from all over the world, and I was fortunate to be one of those 1,000. You know, we had no idea how we're going to get to Moscow, and then how long the conference would last, and when we get back. But I think that was really an extraordinary week we spent in Moscow. And one of the people who was most outspoken during our section of the conference, which was I think it was called the scientific academic section, was Sakharov. And Sakharov was able to speak out very critically of Gorbachev, very critically of Ronald Reagan back then. And we really knew there was a much more cooperative period about to enter into force. Secondly, I'd like to mention that you know, we've accomplished the peace movement in general. I think all over the world has accomplished an enormous amount of things over the last several decades, and we shouldn't make light of that. I mean, all the way from the INF treaty that Reiner mentioned, you know, up to the new treaty to ban nuclear weapons. But you know, in the interim, we banned cluster bombs, we banned landmines. You know, none of these treaties are universal yet. We banned chemical weapons, which I've been involved with a lot, as some of you know, over the last 25 years. And to me, even though we've all operated on a wing and a prayer, as we say, with very little resources, we've really been able to accomplish a lot. And I think we have to all continue as best we can. The question I wanted to pose to both Reiner and Colin was, what do you think we did wrong, say, over the last three or four decades? I mean, I think in particular at the time, I thought at the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I was there in Germany the next week after the wall fell, and, you know, hammered out my little piece of the wall in Berlin next to the Brandenburg Gate. It struck me that the reunification of Germany probably went much too fast. And at the time, I know there was quite a wide debate as to whether, you know, Wiedervereinigung really should have gone so fast forward, because it was, to some extent, I think, threatening to the East and to the Soviet Union. And the second issue, which really still troubles me, is NATO's push to expand so quickly as it did. And I think if we had not, none of us, I think, were involved in any of this, but if NATO had not pushed so fast to expand to the East, I think Reiner referred to it as, you know, a very visible aggression by NATO at the end of the Cold War. After the Warsaw Treaty Organization had disbanded, maybe much more success would have been had. And I think there are probably some strategic mistakes. Maybe they were not possible to do otherwise at the time, particularly the reunification of Germany. I know all Germans were in favor of that, as far as I remember. But I'm wondering if there are things we should have done better back then, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, that would have helped a lot in moving us towards a more peaceful world today. And I'll stop there.
Very good question. As we have more questions, maybe one of you answers, and then we keep on the chat.
You know, I think, Colin, Paul, this is the start of the next webinar, the successes and failures of the peace movement. It is, and you know, when you mentioned the quick unification process and the enlargement of NATO, we have not done it. As peace movement, we were from the first moment, and we were opposing the enlargement of NATO. You know, we were always remembering the politicians and the political leaders to the Charter of Paris, which was absolutely opposite of enlarging the military alliance to the East. So, but you know, I think we, from my understanding, we made two big mistakes. One big mistake is that we forgot that we need a new generation in the peace movement. And so the process of generation changed much too late and much too slow. And this is a problem of today, when you are looking to all our white and gray hairs. Not always, but in many of the peace organizations, that is a huge problem. And this is definitely our responsibility. And, you know, I'm very happy to say for IPB that we adopted in the last board meeting 6 young men and women to the IPB Council to really develop a new generation, take the lead of the organization. This is definitely a mistake as peace movement. The second is, I think we underestimate that above all the United States, but also many of the Western political leaders never want really to have equal relations to Russia. That they always want to have Russia depending from them or fight against them. And it takes maybe too long till we recognized that we again have to fight for common security and the politics of common agreement on the same level of ice with Russia. I think we're doing this much too late. And this is also a problem till today. And my third point, you know, which is our mistake again, is that we are up to now not really a worldwide peace movement. We are a peace movement mainly of the Western industrial countries. And the change of the world to a much more global world with a huge impact of Asia, which much bigger role of Asia, this is not reflected in the work of the peace movement. So this is also a challenge for the peace movement, that we really have to become global. You know, when you read Berta von Suttner, she was starting discussing it in relation to the colonies. And now we are seeing this in the new globalized world. So this is definitely small part of answers for the discussion which we should deepen, but some elements from my side.
Arielle, would you allow me 3 quick words?
Yes, come on.
I can't hear you. Oh, yeah. Okay. I've written down 3 words on this paper, which sort of in a way characterize the whole period, or the key moments. 1 is globalization, 2 is terrorism, and 3 is populism. And I think all 3 have cast a shadow over this very difficult period that we're living through. And in a sense, we're still living with all 3 of them. The globalization became evident, obviously, with Reagan and Thatcher from the 80s, but it sort of accelerated in the 90s under Clinton and the opening up of the Eastern Europe and so on. And what kind of model for economic and social development we have created, which is extremely unequal and has allowed corporations to plunder the world, essentially. So that's been number 1. I don't think we've developed our critique early enough and strongly enough. Secondly, terrorism, we didn't see it coming. You know, there were terrorist acts in the 90s that foreshadowed 9/11. And of course, we've seen many terrible events since then. And that, of course, has been the perfect opportunity for especially Western, but also Russian and Chinese and many other, almost every state has an anti-terrorism policy and has justified all kinds of wars, particularly in the Muslim countries in the last 20 years. And thirdly, we've now got, you know, not just one Trump, but I mean, dozens of them all over the world. I mean, these so-called, what I call the Iron Men, who have ridden the waves of a kind of populist feeling, a disillusionment with the elites. In my own country, we had the Brexit phenomenon, we have Johnson. I mean, all the way from Bolsonaro right over to Duterte. I mean, there are authoritarian leaders everywhere, and we somehow missed a trick in not developing a strong enough opposition to those developments. So I think it's a heavy analysis to realize that we haven't been up to the challenge. Not only have we not abolished war, not abolished nuclear weapons, but we haven't done these things either. However, let's not beat ourselves on the back. We have done many wonderful things along the way, but because we set our goals so very high, we're bound to at some times fail. But I know Reiner has a plan for a further discussion about all this.
Yes, sorry, I just raise your attention to Christoph's contribution in the chat. So he misremembering of the persons and organization which created the possibility of the dialogue between West and East in 1989. So if you have any comments on that, please do so.
You know, I tried to mention some organizations in the 80s which were also following in the 90s. You know, one of the two big events of the END was in 89 and 90s. They were in Colin and in Moscow. So they are really a very important element, and the main players of the politics of the Detente were Palme, Kreisky, and Braun, which I tried to mention. I can only underline what Paul was saying. You know, who was really a part of the 90s knows which role Gorbachev was playing. From my understanding, Gorbachev makes a lot of mistakes. For example, his biggest mistakes was to agree with the German unification under NATO control, under NATO presence of Germany. We can discuss a lot about this, but without him, the whole process of the 80s away from 70,000 nuclear weapons, reducing the INF treaty and all the other treaties were not possible. You know, it could happen also, no one could see that all these changes in East Europe could also go deep into bloody activities and actions. And these changes in East Europe were changed mainly without bloody events, when I exclude Romania. So this is really his historical work. And so I think that we have to accept. And, you know, directly after these changes, with the Charter of Paris, which were signed by all European countries, you can see the European leaders which wanted partly to bring Europe together. This was very much the Scandinavian countries. But this was also Poland in 1990. Poland in 1990 don't want to join NATO. It wants to have a politics of security with all countries in Europe. And then the bloody US sell them all their weapons. And so that was the background. The NATO enlargement is the best project of the US military industry in the 90s. They earned a lot of money by that. So never forget that this was business too. Yeah, so that is a little bit the situation. And I think when you are looking back to the people and to the peace movement, I think one of the biggest changes and successes of the peace movement in the 90s, which were East and West and international, were the development of the international organization working in environment and development. I will only mention ATTAC, one of the most important ones, which brings together many different social movements. And I think also I have not mentioned enough in my speech, the whole interreligious work internationally with the religious youth conference in the world. They're very important to bring together people also from East and West. And today, you know, it is, from my understanding, not so easy to create again common work with the East Europeans, because we really don't have any movement in these countries. We have peace activists in Russia, we have peace activists in Poland too, but we cannot speak about a peace movement. So this is one of the main challenges IPB is really deeply working on, that we develop new and more context to the East European and Central European countries.
Okay, so we have several minutes more, and Thomas has asked for to say a word. So please, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Right. Hello. Greetings, everyone. Yeah, I founded Philosophers and Historians for Peace in 1983 in London. So I'm very familiar with the history of this whole period. And I went to Moscow in 1990 to a global gathering of philosophers. And I've been working at that ever since. I'm interested in intellectual history. And as a philosopher, you know, what mistakes have we made? I think I've been working on a synthesis between, you know, the socialist and capitalist models. I think we gave away too much to capitalism. And I think we have a huge problem on our hands with the militarization of capitalism. And I think the Treaty of Paris, which I loved in 1990, we all were so idealistic, but we were so naive, because the military industrial complex of especially the US and the UK was completely cynical. They had no intention of developing peace. Their model is victory and world conquest, actually. So fast forward, I also think we shouldn't underestimate just how evil and sneaky these people are. The military industrial complex, I call it the military espionage industrial complex, have now created a system of psychological warfare revealed in this book, if you can see this book, by Chris Wiley. This is a must read for everyone on this seminar. He worked for Cambridge Analytica, which was a military psychological operations company that militarized Facebook, which won the Brexit referendum for the hard right, and it won the Trump election for the hard right. It also brought Duterte to power in the Philippines. It also created a hate thing in Burma for the Muslims. So unless you understand what these military forces are doing, as a peace movement, we're like 100 years behind the scenes. I think this is why I've called, Philosophers of Peace, we've called for a cyber peace treaty. This should all be illegal. And in lots of UN declarations, there's a declaration of the rights of people to peace, which outlaws propaganda by nations against other states. That was way back in 75. Yet, of course, the nations don't do it overtly. They do it in, like covert ways. So anyway, those are some of the and then the final thing I want to say, if there's time, I also heard Colin mention 9/11. And I think the peace movement failed to really realize that 9/11 was not the narrative that we were told by Bush. And I spent 2 years doing in-depth research as a historian. I've got a PhD in history. And I mean, the official story is false. We don't know what was causing 9/11, but it was a very complex, multi-layered conspiracy. And I think the peace movement has to, somehow get on board with that analysis. So I'm setting up an international historical commission into it. Until we know where these wars come from, how can we stop them? So anyway, that's my question.
Thank you very much, Thomas. This is a lot to share. Then I propose that we give the floor to Marlene and then to Linda, and words of conclusion from Reiner and Colin, because we are late. So thank you very much. Marlene?
Yes. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, I just want to raise two aspects very quickly. And the first relates to what I didn't find on Colin's menu of appetizers was an explicit reference to environmental movements. And certainly there's a great opportunity for confluence between peace issues, criticism of nuclear weapons, or military spending in general, and the peace movement. And maybe it's implicit in everything you've said, and in particular in the disarmament for sustainable development with the emphasis on sustainable. But it's a bridge, certainly, that deserves to be made very explicit, a bridge to a wider movement, and particularly involving youth. And the other thing I wanted to just call your attention to, it's not on the agenda of the IPB particularly at all, but in 2001, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325. Now, you mentioned the participation of women in peace movements, but also 1325 was aimed at the inclusion of women in the peacemaking process. And I think that's really an important area that we should be aware of, that the emphasis that should be placed on this. You don't have to respond because there are other questions, unless somebody has a particular comment. I can't resist mentioning this though, Colin. I'm under the influence of a recent article I read in Harper's about the origin of the term populism, which has to do with the Progressive Party in the late 19th century in the US. And populism is a loose term. The peace movement, we hope to make a popular movement, a populist movement. Environmental movement is a populist movement. Bernie Sanders was a populist leader in that sense. I would prefer the term nativist. It may not be completely accurate, but I think it's maybe better than populism. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Linda also wants to speak about maybe interconnectivity or connections. So the floor is yours, and then we have a young man to speak.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I wanted to say something similar to Marlene, really, that the issues that inspire young people are all about the environment, protecting the future of the planet, and now about fighting racism. And I think the most urgent thing we've got to do is to make all those young people and all the many people who've become active in the last few years understand the enormous role of militarization and war in damaging the planet and wasting its resources, and that we can't have a Green New Deal and we can't build back to a better future without demilitarization and denuclearization and switching the resources and the skills to meeting our real security needs. So often environmental campaigners never seem to think about war and militarization and the vast amount of resources that go into it. And IPB has led the way really with all its campaigns on demilitarization and sustainable development. But I think we really need to push it harder than ever now and bring it sort of into the center of all the current campaigns for a better, fairer future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would give the floor now to A Young Moon. He's the last one to have asked for the floor, and thank you. She is, and please stay with us. It won't be long. We just have several minutes, and then we'll close. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm saying hello to you from South Korea, Seoul, and it's 1:40 a.m. here. So I'm very sleepy and I'm not so sure that my English will work. But thank you for providing this webinar, and I learned a lot. And I think you mentioned lots of, role of youth activists and younger generations, and relatively looks like I'm younger here. So I am one of the new council member of IPB that Reiner Braun mentioned earlier. And I was very happy to join IPB. And you said, some of you mentioned that this international peace movement has failed somehow to bring up younger generation into the field. But I do not think in that way, because the result of the peace movements is not really coming from the result right after what you have done. It's like peace education. You have been doing lots of peace education for general public, and I'm kind of the result of what you have done. From this like small city in South Korea, I was born into this divided country, and I realized our country and society is militarized and there is no peace education. And I studied to be a teacher, but I chose to be a peace activist, especially specialized in peace education and working for teacher training here. So I don't want to really, how do you say that? Admit what you have said, that peace movement is failed. I think it's really, really successful. But as you said, that it takes longer time and much more efforts. So I'm also, how do you say that? I'm trying to get more attention of young generations in South Korea and Asia. And this opportunity to be a part of IPB will bring more opportunities to be connected with, youth worldwide. So I just wanted to say that to you. And also today, I don't know, some of you might know about what happened in Korean Peninsula today. North Korea just blows up the inter-Korean liaison office. So the situation is getting worse here, and we are not expecting anything from Donald Trump, and we don't know how can we proceed with the Korean peace process. So I think I'm living in a country where the war is still ongoing, and we are thinking how to end the Korean War. And there is a campaign starting from June 25th and the Korean War campaign. And I think we will request your support, and we will ask IPB to sign for the petition to end the Korean War. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do together, and I want to see more younger faces in this webinar in the future. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much. I think we could keep on for hours discussing all this together. This gives ideas for the next webinar, isn't it? So Reiner and Colin, please, few words of conclusion, and let's see each other again.
Oops.
So, yeah, I will make it very easy and short. You know, I can only say yes, yes, and yes again to the three last comments. Absolutely agree with the environmental movement. We are definitely trying to get new steps in that. You know, I think we all not mentioned enough the role of women in the peace movement, the peace actions in the 80s. I'm happy that Kate had it in her speech, but this is absolutely true. And, you know, what I would like is to promise that we will continue with these historical webinars. And maybe the next webinar will be touching the question of successes and failures of the peace movement, historically and actual. And I think this could be, again, a very interesting discussion, bringing new points together. And we are doing this not only because we want to look to the history. We are doing this because we want to have more intensive fights for the future with more young people. Thank you.
Please, Colin.
Things. I mean, I agree completely with Reiner in endorsing what was said, but I don't want to go over it again. I think Thomas is right that we have to develop our critique of militarism and its relationship with the capitalist system. That's absolutely clear. Linda is right that we've got to promote the Green New Deal as a kind of package of change. There's a campaign in Britain called Build Back Better. In other words, after the virus is over, let's have a different world with all the good things that we know we have to do. That kind of approach, I think, will get very wide public support. Certainly, the gender aspect is crucial. I mean, I mentioned in the timeline the Me Too movement, which has done an enormous amount to raise a kind of new wave of feminism in our time. And Black Lives Matter doing something similar around the race agenda. So we've got gender, we have race, but we also have class and also age, which are crucial dimensions of social fracture, but also social cohesion, potentially, if we build the alliances right. And environment is everyone's issue. And it's really a question of survival. I mean, last night I picked up a book called In a Dark Time, which is really from the 1980s, and it's all about the threat of nuclear weapons, 50,000 nuclear weapons threatening to blow up the world, and they still are, even if it's only 15,000. But we're also in another dark time around climate, the potential extinction eventually of all civilization, the planet becoming unlivable. And on top of this, we have to fight a virus. So it is a very dark time, but our business is to light the candles and show the way forward. So get your matches out. Let's light the way forward.
Thank you so much, everybody, all the participants and the contributors. It's been really interesting. You will be able to see, and also, sorry, all the technical support from Sean and Eskel. Thank you very much. You will be able, because of them, to see this webinar on YouTube and share it with your friends. And yeah, so thank you very much. I think it needs a third part, or maybe we create a new cycle of webinars exploring today's challenges. I think that's on the table now. So that's because of you. Thank you so much and take care. Goodbye.